Hi, welcome to the first of our lectures on colonial America. I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about why Europeans came to the Americas in the first place, and your textbook does a good job of this, of course, and I just wanted to cover a couple of other points. Um, there's a question of why do Europeans conquer the Americas? And I mean that both in the sense of why do they come in the first place, what's their own motivation, as well as why are they able to conquer the Americas. And of course, the more traditional explanation that you would get from a history course up until pretty recently would be that Europeans were superior in their civilization. They had better weaponry. They were smarter. They were more powerful, whatever it is. And while there's a grain of truth to that, of course, and we'll talk about what truth there is there in just a minute, as you know now, there's also another explanation that is completely unrelated to the people, whether Americans or Europeans at the time, and that is germs and disease. And the Europeans, of course, had no superiority in this sense. In fact, they were far weaker physically, but they had been exposed to a much greater number of diseases, a much greater number of deadly viruses, in fact, than what the Americans had been exposed to at that point. And as we talked about last time, I think, something around the 90% of the coastal population of Native Americans was depleted. They completely died off because of disease prior to Europeans settling in many of the coastal areas, especially in New England region. So that is a big part of the explanation of how this happens. Why are they able to do this? They're also able to do this because of these accidents of geography. They inherited, these Europeans inherited all this knowledge from other civilizations in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, and in Europe too. And these earlier, older world civilizations shared all sorts of new knowledge, new discoveries, new technologies with each other. That included writing, of course, and writing enabled knowledge to spread even quicker and more broadly. And native societies, of course, didn't have this. And one of the arguments that's been made by geographers in recent decades is that it's simply that you have an east-west axis sharing crops and livestock as well as disease, germs, technology, everything that runs from Europe, in the west, eastwards to China and Japan, and runs as far south as the northern parts of Africa, certainly through the Middle East, all the way to Asia. And so that band is very important because that band shares a pretty similar climate, right? You have sort of a temperate zone there that stretches across, and so various crops like your wheat and your barley and whatnot can spread. Livestock can survive throughout that climate region, and so it's very easy for civilization to spread on that east-west axis. On the other hand, in North and South America, as you know, we have more of a north-south axis, and the north-south axis doesn't share the same climate. So those Native American populations that run from Alaska and northern Canada, the Inuit people, down through North America, down through Central America, into South America, and all the way down to the southern tip of South America. Those are pretty extreme climate changes, and you can't share crops or livestock in all those different climates. Things that grow in some areas won't grow in others, and so it was much more difficult because of that north-south axis to spread culture, to spread technology, etc. So that also explains something of why Europeans were at such an advantage at this moment in 1492 and afterwards. Why did Europeans want to come to the Americas? There's certainly, in the traditional explanations, some truth in that some Europeans were devout Christians and wanted to spread Christianity. And once they came across this population of Native Americans who didn't know about Christianity, there were a number of effects in Europe, one of which was that it kind of destabilized Christianity, because Christianity was this whole system that didn't really allow for other groups who never were exposed to any of the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Now you have a whole group of people who, have no idea about that stuff. That doesn't fit very well with, the Bible as history, and so that kind of throws into some chaos Christian understandings of the world and the universe in Europe. But another thing that comes out of that is that Europeans who are devout want to spread the word. They want to spread the gospel of Christ to native peoples. And so some of the people who come to the Americas want to do that. And they, of course, think they're doing good in that. And some of them are doing good. Some of them, in fact, are protecting native peoples from slavery, protecting native peoples from destruction, because they want to convert them to Christianity and save their souls. That's one factor. It's certainly not the main factor that drives European conquest and settlement. The main factor is greed, and we could come up with a nicer term for it, but it's basically greed. People who wanted to make money. Christopher Columbus is a prime example of this, of course, as you'll read in the as you read in the Lowen chapter. The motivation was to make money, right? To find gold, to find silver, to find valuables of any kind and enrich oneself. That's the primary motivation of these early immigrants or migrants to the Americas. There's competition for this, of course, and there's competition between individuals as well as competition between nations. And again, nations are just getting started in Europe in this point. And it's really important that you try to understand this point, that we're not talking about nations that existed and then decided to go off and start colonizing other places and exploiting their resources. These nations are in the process, the very early stages of forming themselves, and part of that process is establishing colonies that they can exploit and take resources out of, including people in many cases, slaves, in order to build their new nations and strengthen their new nations. Again, Columbus working for Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain is a clear example of this. But all of these explorers are doing the same kind of thing for one nation or another. They're helping these new monarchs who have established themselves as the heads of these new nations in Europe to build a foundation for their nation state. And part of that is through this colonial process. So it's not like later colonialism we'll get to, in the 19th century when, Great Britain establishes a second British Empire, basically, and takes over India and, parts of Southeast Asia and so on. That's a completely different sort of thing than what we're talking about in the 16th and 17th centuries, when these European territories are just beginning to become nations in their own rights, and these monarchs are still trying to consolidate their power at home as well as abroad. So, we talked last week then about the story of Tisquantum, or Squanto, and how that story complicates our understanding somewhat of native societies in colonial America and pre-colonial America. And you've read now the Columbus chapter by Lowen, and so that hopefully has complicated your understanding of Columbus. And so together we have hopefully a broader sense now of this period of exploration and the period of early conquest and settlement, and how it was that Europeans were able to move into New England in our example of Tisquantum. So today I want to talk more about New England specifically and get into the Pilgrims and the Puritans in Massachusetts and talk about Rhode Island and Connecticut a little bit. And that's as far as we will go today. So New England we again we have the sense that the Pilgrims kind of show up and they're the first people to arrive or something. But of course, there are fishermen. There are these fishing vessels that have been operating off the coast of New England for a long time before the Puritans arrive. And even when the Puritans arrive, there are people who are with them who are not, in fact, Puritans or separatists themselves and are fairly indifferent to religion, but they have come along for the ride and they've served on the Mayflower. And as other Puritans will begin to arrive, especially after 1630 in Boston, you'll have a lot of people there who aren't Puritans, who aren't particularly devout, and that will create some strife in the colonies. But again, it also helps to remind us that our image in our head of these early pilgrims, usually we don't include these other people who really weren't part of that group, but were here and had come to start a new life in New England as well. So fishing was the first big industry in New England, and that's where Europeans made their money in the early days. Before settlement, that was the only game in town. There weren't a lot of land settlements, not a lot of trading going on, so fishing was the primary economy. Once these early settlements are established, you have more fur trapping and trading with Indians. And that's the next major economy that's established. And so these trade networks are established all through New England and the Northeast, in fact. And depending on which nation you're talking about, the Netherlands and their establishment of New Netherlands and Amsterdam, now New York, they're trading mainly with the Iroquois. You have, of course, in New England, these different trade networks established with the Narragansett or the Pequot or the Wampanoag, depending on where you are. And generally speaking, these trade networks, once you got them in place, they stayed in place for decades at a time, unless something came along to disturb them. And so the trade just goes back and forth between one group and another group, and there's basically monopolies on trading networks. It's not an open market. It's not a free market. It's you establish a connection, you maintain that connection, and you have a monopoly on that particular trade network until something disrupts it. By the 1650s, though, by the middle of the 1600s, there's hardly any fur left to trade in New England. The native societies had, of course, been trapping beaver and other animals for their fur for a long time, but with the arrival of Europeans and the much greater demand to provide fur back to Europe, native peoples as well as European trappers started to trap too many animals, and very quickly they deplete the resources and drive those animals out of existence. So the fur trade doesn't last for very long in New England, and increasingly traders will have to go deeper and deeper into the interior, into the Great Lakes region, and even out to the far west of the continent fairly soon, because they can't find any animals to trap in New England. The first group that comes to Plymouth, what was called Patuxet, in Tisquantum's time, the first group that comes to Plymouth were separatists. And it's important that you understand this distinction, again, it's in your textbook, between separatists and Puritans. Important to some degree, I guess. The separatists separated from the Church of England, whereas the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England. And that's the fundamental difference. It's fairly easy to remember, I think. The separatists had left England and had gone to the Netherlands, to Holland. And the Netherlands, even back then, as it is today, is a very tolerant place. There's freedom of worship for Protestants, not Catholics, in these days in the Netherlands. And that's why the the separatists go there. They later described in some detail why they then left the Netherlands, went back to England, and then decided to come to try their luck in America. And that's because the culture in the Netherlands was too tolerant. It was too open. Since they allowed for freedom of religion, the Puritans, the separatists, found they couldn't control their children, especially They couldn't control their community when there were these alternatives that were allowed to flourish as well in the religious marketplace. And what they wanted was an area where they could control their population, control religious thinking entirely, and enforce as rigidly as possible the rules governing their society. So that's why they have to leave the Netherlands. It was too free, too open of a society, and they come to America, to New England, to establish a stricter form of worship where they can control more tightly their community. They were supposed to go to Virginia. They had permission to go to Virginia, but they missed it by quite a bit. And instead they found themselves off of Cape Cod. They had a charter that said they could go and settle in Virginia, but obviously that charter wasn't going to work for Cape Cod. And so they drew up this document while they were still on their boat called the Mayflower Compact. 1620 is the date on this. And this is a very important document in American history, up there with the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution probably. The Mayflower Compact bound them all together. Even the non-separatists, those who weren't, even particularly religious, who were on board the Mayflower, all pledged that they would abide by whatever decisions were reached by the community. It's not quite democracy. We're not talking about one person, one vote, or anything like that, but we're talking about a community consensus. And if the community decides something, then everyone now has agreed to abide by that decision. And you can see then this is certainly moving us along the path towards democratic thinking in the American colonies. The separatists were a small group, and once the larger groups of Puritans start to emigrate from England, the separatists will basically be absorbed into the Puritan settlements and they'll disappear. The Puritans, as I said, are not trying to leave the Church of England. They're really trying to purify it, make it better, whereas the separatists had already rejected the Church of England and said, there's no way to make it better. We just have to leave and start our new church. One important thing that the Puritans will adopt from the separatists is Congregationalist churches. And you'll still see, around New England, a lot of churches that are labeled Congregationalist. And they do descend from these early Puritan churches. But all that means is that the congregation has the power. They get to choose who will be their minister. It's a democratic idea then, very much in contrast to the Church of England, where the church is basically allied with the state, and the monarch, the king or queen, gets to appoint the head of the Church of England. It's very much opposed as well to Catholicism and the hierarchy of priests and bishops and archbishops and the Pope. To say that each congregation, each group of church members has the authority to choose their own direction, to choose their own leader. It's a very Protestant idea, and it's a very democratic idea compared to anything else that was going on at the time, at least. So the Puritans do take that from the separatists, and then Puritanism in New England will follow that Congregationalist model for the most part, not completely, but most Puritan churches will do that. Again, it's worth reminding you, even though I talked about it already at length, the Pilgrims, the separatists who arrived at Plymouth, would never have survived if not for Tisquantum or Squanto, who shows up in their village speaking English to them fluently, surprising them very much, as you can imagine, as he walks out of the woods and greets them in English. I can't emphasize enough that the Pilgrims rather, did not arrive in a wilderness. They arrived in an area that was well settled, but that had recently seen terrible destruction because of the spread of disease. The Puritans and the separatists had to go back to their supporters in England and ask for a new land grant because their charter for land in Virginia, of course, was not valid. and they were able to secure a new land grant as well as new financial support from the Royal Council for New England, and they got a patent for a company called the Massachusetts Company. The company then wanted to make money, and they sent about 100 settlers over under the leadership of a man named John Endicott in 1628. 1 year after that, in 1629, King Charles I dissolved Parliament in London, and this begins the English Civil War period. And the English Civil War period is very important, as for one thing, you'll see then heavy settlement by Puritans in the early 1630s, and then settlement slowing down once the Puritans win the English Civil War and Charles I is beheaded and the monarchy is declared over, and you have this dictatorship led by Oliver Cromwell in England in the 1640s. All these things that are going on in England will have a big impact on New England. And then the period of instability that follows in England, where you have civil war, you have this dictatorship by Cromwell, England is divided up into military districts and ruled by Cromwell's generals. Then you have the restoration of the English monarchy in the 1660s, and all of that is important for us just because it means that during all this period, nobody's paying much attention to New England, and New England is being left to develop more or less on its own. This is what we call benign neglect, or this is what the colonists called benign neglect, this period where the mother country, England, wasn't paying any attention to its colonies, and consequently they were able to govern themselves and have democracy, more or less, in the colonies. And it's later on when England decides, it's going to more strictly manage its colonies, that we begin to see conflict and strife that eventually will lead to the American Revolution. But that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. 1630 is when we see the arrival of the Winthrop fleet. John Winthrop was a Puritan gentleman who would become one of the foremost leaders of the new colony in Massachusetts. This is when we start to see massive settlement arriving in Boston and in Salem and a few other towns in the 1630s. During the 1630s, then, about 20,000 more Puritans are going to follow these early settlers, and by the end of the 1630s, we've got English people living in the Connecticut Valley, from basically Plymouth and Boston and Salem in the east through Rhode Island and Connecticut in the west. Your textbook emphasizes this. I'll emphasize this too. What makes New England so special in terms of frontier societies, and certainly in terms of early colonies, is that you have families moving together, whole generations moving together, grandparents, their children, their grandchildren, husbands and wives, cousins, whole families moving together, and often whole communities moving together, and a whole community will up and leave England and come to America together. There's a tight-knit community structure here then that's moving, and this is very different than settlement in Virginia. This is very different than settlement in the Carolinas. This is completely different than what's going on in the Caribbean islands, Jamaica, or the Bahamas, or these other Caribbean islands. It's different than any frontier society really in history, where usually you have young men going out on the frontier first, and only later do you see women and families moving out to the frontier regions. New England migration is different than all these other cases because of these family structures. You want to set up a new town, you bring your old town with you. You build a church, you build a school. These are things that aren't happening in the South, and consequently you have a very different type of community that's established in New England than what's established anywhere else. It's a very literate society too. You have schools and churches established right away. Children are going to school as well as working. Everybody knows how to read. It's a highly literate society compared to any society in America that comes afterwards, up until pretty recently. People live a long time. Basically, the life expectancy in New England in the colonial period is about the same as it is today in New England. If you take out children who die as infants, which we could do a better job of that today than they could at that point. But basically, people lived as long as they do today, as long as they got past those infancy diseases. Farming is small, family-based farms. The children are working the farms. Farmers will often hire out their children for wages to neighbors. So neighbors will sort of share children as laborers that they'll pass around. The children earn the wages, and of course they don't get to keep the wages. The wages go back to their parents. And then there are some wage laborers who don't own land, who go around and earn wages on farms, but don't own their own land too. Shipping is the dominant industry for people who want to make a lot of money in New England. New England shippers, in fact, are helped by the navigation acts that Great Britain will pass and that later American revolutionaries will complain about. But what the navigation acts did was they restricted all trade between the American colonies and Great Britain to British vessels. But British vessels meant any vessel that was built by British subjects, and those British subjects could live in Massachusetts or Rhode Island or England or Ireland. All these parts are considered to be part of the British Empire, of course. And so this law actually helped New England shipmakers because it meant that their rivals in French or Spanish-held territories or Dutch territories could not compete with them. And this was particularly useful when it came to the Dutch shipbuilders of New York, then still called New Netherlands. They couldn't compete because they weren't British. It's also important to point out to you that the routes are basically back and forth routes. We have this idea of triangle trade, where manufactured goods can be sent to colonies, and in Africa, then slaves will be taken to the Caribbean and to the Americas, and then the raw materials that they produce will be taken back to Great Britain, and you have this sort of triangle. But in fact, what people did was they weren't moving around in a triangle, they were moving back and forth. Again, the idea at this point, it was you established a trade route and you got a monopoly on that. You made your connections, you signed your deal, you shook hands, and so you traded with this one guy. So you had merchants leaving Providence, and they would have one guy they traded with in Jamaica, for example, or they had one guy they traded with in Cape Verde, or one guy they traded with off Ghana in Africa, but they weren't going all over the world. They were just going back and forth on these trade routes. But shipping becomes then a really important part of New England's economy very early on. So let me stop at this point, and then I want to talk more about Puritans in the next part of the lecture.